The rain that fell on the day they buried Julian Vance wasn't the dramatic, thundering downpour one might expect in a tragedy. It was a cold, persistent drizzle that seeped into the bones, turning the sprawling lawns of the Oak Haven Cemetery into a muted canvas of gray and green. Eleanor Ellie Vance stood at the edge of the open grave, a solitary figure in black silk, clutching a single white rose. At 32, she was supposed to be in the prime of her life. She and Julian had built an empire, a home, and a future. Julian, with his sharp mind and endless ambition, had created a tech legacy that most people only read about in financial magazines. Now that brilliant mind was gone, extinguished in a horrific pileup on the interstate just 5 days ago. Ellie stared down at the polished mahogany casket, the polished wood gleaming wetly in the mist. She felt entirely hollowed out, as if the impact that had taken Julian's life had simultaneously shattered her own chest, leaving nothing but an echoing void. She barely registered the comforting murmur of the priest, or the respectful distance kept by Julian's business associates, who stood in a sea of dark umbrellas behind her. What she did register, however, was the heavy, suffocating presence of her family flanking her on either side. Her mother, Margaret Sterling, stood to Ellie's right, weeping with a theatrical intensity that drew the eyes of the other mourners. Margaret dabbed at her perfectly powdered cheeks with a lace handkerchief, her sobs sharp and rhythmic. To Ellie's left stood her father, Arthur, his jaw set in an expression of stoic grief. He had one heavy arm draped protectively, or perhaps possessively, over Ellie's trembling shoulders. And standing just behind them, sheltered under a large, custom monogrammed umbrella, was Ellie's older sister, Chloe. Chloe, at 36, looked less like a grieving sister and more like a woman attending a somber high society gala. Her black designer coat was belted tightly at the waist, her dark sunglasses masking her eyes, though her posture radiated an unmistakable aura of impatience. "It's time, sweetheart," Arthur murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that had always commanded absolute authority in the Sterling household. His fingers tightened on Ellie's shoulder, a subtle pressure meant to guide her. "Say goodbye to him." Ellie stepped forward, her knees feeling like water. She let the white rose slip from her gloved fingers. It fell silently, landing against the dark wood of the casket. She closed her eyes, wishing for tears, but she was too exhausted to cry. The grief was too massive, too incomprehensible to be expressed in something as simple as weeping. She was a widow at 32. She had a 2-year-old son, Leo, who was currently at home with his nanny, too young to understand why his father would never walk through the front door again. As the funeral concluded and the crowd began to disperse, moving toward the line of waiting black cars, Margaret wrapped her arms around Ellie. The scent of her mother's heavy, floral perfume was overwhelming, masking the crisp smell of the rain. "Oh, my poor, sweet girl," Margaret crooned, pressing Ellie's face into her shoulder. "My baby, I can't bear to see you like this. But don't you worry. We are here. Mommy and Daddy are right here. We aren't going anywhere." Arthur stepped up, nodding firmly. "We've already arranged everything, Ellie. We've packed our bags. We're moving into the guest wing of the house. You are not going to be alone in that massive place. You need us, and Leo needs his grandparents." Ellie blinked, the words filtering slowly through the thick fog of her grief. Move in? The thought of her parents taking up residence in the quiet sanctuary she had shared with Julian felt jarring. Arthur and Margaret had never been particularly close to Julian. They had always viewed him with a mixture of intimidation and quiet resentment, masking their envy of his immense wealth behind thinly veiled comments about his workaholic nature and new money. You don't have to do that," Ellie managed to say, her voice cracking. "I have Maria to help with Leo. I think I need some quiet." Chloe stepped forward, lowering her sunglasses to peer at her younger sister. "Don't be ridiculous, Ellie," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "You look like you're about to collapse. You can barely string a sentence together. How are you supposed to run that estate and raise a toddler by yourself right now? It takes a village, and we are your village." "Chloe is right," Margaret added smoothly, her manicured hand stroking Ellie's damp hair. "You are in a state of shock, darling. People make terrible decisions when they're grieving. We are family. Family protects each other. Let us carry the burden for a while." Exhausted, completely drained of the energy required to argue, Ellie simply nodded. It was the first concession. A tiny, seemingly harmless crack in the foundation of her independence. She didn't know it then, standing in the cold Texas rain, but she had just opened the door to the predators. The Vance estate was a sprawling modern architectural marvel situated on 40 acres of pristine woodland just outside of Dallas. It was a home filled with light, designed with floor-to-ceiling windows that brought the outside in. Julian had built it as a sanctuary for his growing family. But within 3 days of the funeral, the house felt entirely different. It felt occupied. The silence that should have accompanied Ellie's mourning was shattered by the constant chaotic presence of her family. Margaret had immediately taken over the kitchen, dismissing the private chef Julian had hired, claiming that nothing heals the soul like a mother's home cooking. In reality, it meant the house constantly smelled of heavy casseroles and fried foods that Ellie had no appetite for, and Margaret spent hours complaining about how complicated the imported Italian appliances were to use. Chloe had claimed the largest guest suite, the one with the private balcony overlooking the rose garden. Within hours, she had unpacked suitcases full of designer clothes, treating the tragic occasion like an extended luxury vacation. Ellie frequently found Chloe wandering through the master wing, her eyes lingering on the expensive artwork Julian had collected, her fingers trailing over the imported silk curtains. But it was Arthur whose presence was the most invasive. Julian's home office was a sacred space. It was a vast, wood-paneled room lined with books, featuring a massive mahogany desk where Julian had built his tech empire. Ellie hadn't been able to bring herself to even turn the doorknob since the accident. But on the 4th morning after the funeral, Ellie walked downstairs to find the study door wide open. Arthur was sitting in Julian's custom leather chair. Spread across the pristine surface of the desk were stacks of files, financial ledgers, and legal documents. Arthur was speaking loudly into his cell phone, waving a gold pen in the air. Yes, I understand the market is volatile, but we need to secure these assets immediately," Arthur barked into the phone. He looked up, spotting Ellie hovering in the doorway. He didn't flinch. He merely held up a finger, signaling her to wait, before finishing his call. "Just draft the preliminary documents and send them to my email. I'll review them tonight." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk, offering Ellie a warm, paternal smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ellie, sweetheart, you're up early. Did you sleep at all?" Ellie stared at him, her heart giving a painful thud. "Dad, what are you doing in here? Those are Julian's private files." Arthur sighed, a heavy, long-suffering sound, and stood up. He walked around the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "I know it's hard to see someone else in his chair, Elle. Believe me, I take no joy in this. But somebody has to steer the ship. Julian was a brilliant man, but his affairs... My God, Ellie, they are a labyrinth. The company, the investments, the real estate holdings. It's overwhelming." "Julian had a team of wealth managers," Ellie said, her voice trembling slightly. "He had lawyers. They handle all of this." "Lawyers and wealth managers who bill by the hour," Arthur countered smoothly, stepping closer to place a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Blood is blood, Ellie. Those suits in the high-rises, they don't care about you. They care about their cut. I was up until 3 in the morning looking through these preliminary ledgers. There are complexities here that need a family member's oversight, someone who has your best interests at heart." Margaret walked into the room at that moment, carrying a silver tray with a pot of coffee and 3 porcelain cups. She set it down on the small table near the leather sofa. "Arthur is right. Darling, you should have seen him last night, rubbing his eyes, poring over those awful spreadsheets. He's doing this for you. For little Leo." Ellie looked from her father to her mother. The fog in her brain was thick. Before her marriage, Ellie had been a sharp, highly capable financial analyst. She knew how to read a balance sheet. She knew how trusts worked. But right now, the mere thought of looking at a spreadsheet made her physically nauseous. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone think critically. I don't want to think about money right now," Ellie whispered, rubbing her temples. "I just want my husband back." Margaret rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Ellie, cooing softly. "I know, baby. I know. That's exactly why we are here. You shouldn't have to think about money. You should just focus on healing. Focus on being a mother to that sweet boy upstairs." "Listen to me, Ellie," Arthur said, his tone shifting to something more serious, more urgent. He gestured toward the coffee table. "Sit down. We need to have a very practical conversation. It can't wait." Reluctantly, Ellie allowed herself to be guided to the leather sofa. Margaret poured the coffee, handing a steaming cup to Ellie. Chloe sauntered into the room a moment later, dressed in a silk robe, a mug of herbal tea in her hand. She leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with quiet, calculating eyes. Arthur pulled a thick manila folder from the desk and brought it over to the coffee table. He sat in the armchair opposite Ellie, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Julian's estate is massive, Ellie, but it is not liquid," Arthur began, using the measured, authoritative voice he used to command boardrooms. "His tech firm, Vance Innovations, is currently undergoing a massive internal audit. He was in the middle of a major merger when the accident happened. Because of his sudden death, the SEC and the board of directors have frozen the majority of his corporate assets pending a full review." Ellie frowned, trying to push through the exhaustion. Frozen? But he had the Julian Vance Revocable Trust, the life insurance, the emergency funds. He set it up specifically so that if anything ever happened, Leo and I would be taken care of immediately. "And you are taken care of," Margaret interjected quickly, patting Ellie's knee. "You have a roof over your head. You have food. But the trust is incredibly complicated," Arthur continued, cutting his wife off with a sharp look. "Julian named you as the primary beneficiary, yes. But because of the sudden nature of his passing, the banks are requiring an immense amount of paperwork, tax clearances, and legal wrangling to release the principal funds. Right now, there are massive debts piling up, corporate liabilities, mortgage payments on the commercial properties. If we don't manage this perfectly, the estate could bleed out in legal fees and penalties before the probate court even looks at it." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ellie's numbness. Debts? Julian never mentioned any corporate liabilities that would threaten the personal trust. "Men like Julian, visionaries, they take risks, Ellie," Chloe spoke up from the doorway, taking a slow sip of her tea. "He leveraged a lot to build that company. It's a house of cards. Dad is just trying to keep the wind from knocking it over." "I've spoken to Julian's lead attorney," Arthur said, tapping the manila folder. "He agrees that the best course of action is to establish a temporary co-trustee arrangement, a power of attorney for financial and administrative matters." Arthur opened the folder, revealing a stack of dense legal documents, flagged with yellow sticky notes. He pushed them across the mahogany table toward Ellie. Beside the papers, he placed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen, Julian's pen. "What is this?" Ellie asked, shrinking back slightly from the paperwork. "It's a standard delegation of authority," Arthur explained smoothly. "It temporarily grants me and your sister, since Chloe has experience with startup management, the legal right to act as co-trustees. It allows us to sign checks, negotiate with the creditors, deal with the board of directors, and handle the daily financial administration of the estate." Ellie stared at the documents, the legal jargon blurred before her eyes. "You want me to sign over control of the trust?" "Not control. Ellie, management," Arthur corrected, his voice firm but laced with an undeniable undercurrent of pressure. "You are still the primary beneficiary. We are simply stepping in as the administrators to do the heavy lifting. Do you really want to spend the next 6 months sitting in sterile boardrooms, arguing with corporate lawyers, dealing with IRS auditors? Do you want to be drowning in paperwork while Leo cries for his mother?" The mention of Leo was a calculated strike. Ellie felt a fresh wave of tears prick her eyes. She thought of her son, who had spent the last week wandering the halls, asking when Daddy was coming home from work. She felt like a terrible mother. She was so consumed by her own grief that she barely had the energy to get out of bed, let alone fight a legal war over corporate assets she hadn't looked at in years. I don't know," Ellie stammered, rubbing her eyes. "I should probably have my own lawyer look at this. Someone independent." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Arthur stiffened, his jaw muscles clenching. Margaret gasped softly, pulling her hand away from Ellie's knee, a look of profound hurt crossing her face. "Your own lawyer?" Margaret repeated, her voice trembling with indignation. "Are you saying you don't trust your own father, Eleanor? Your own blood? After we dropped everything, our lives, our home, to move in here and rescue you from this nightmare?" "That's not what I meant. Mom, it certainly sounds like it," Chloe sneered, walking fully into the room and setting her mug down with a hard clack. "Dad has been up for 3 days straight, fighting to keep Julian's creditors from taking this very house, and you're insulting him by demanding an independent lawyer? How paranoid are you?" "I'm not paranoid," Ellie cried out, the noise and the pressure becoming too much. "I just lost my husband. I don't know what I'm doing." "Which is exactly why you need to sign the papers, sweetheart," Arthur said, his voice dropping back to that soothing paternal timbre. He leaned forward, picking up Julian's gold pen and holding it out to her. "I am your father. I have protected you since the day you were born. I would die before I let anyone take a single dime from you or Leo. But my hands are tied. I cannot protect you if you do not give me the legal authority to do so. Let me fight this battle for you. Just sign the papers, Ellie, and you can go upstairs, hold your son, and sleep. We will take care of the rest." Ellie looked at the gold pen. She looked at her father's steady, reassuring face. She looked at her mother's tear-filled eyes, pleading for her trust. She looked at her sister, standing like a sentinel, demanding loyalty. She was so tired. The grief was a physical agony, a monster that demanded all her energy just to survive each passing hour. She just wanted the noise to stop. She wanted to close her eyes and pretend the world hadn't ended. With a trembling hand, Ellie reached out and took the pen. She didn't read the documents. She didn't look at the fine print detailing the broad, sweeping powers she was granting them. She just pulled the thick stack of papers toward her and began to sign where the yellow sticky notes directed her. 1 signature, 2, 3. She signed away her authority on 12 different pages. When she finally set the pen down, the silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't a comforting silence. It was heavy, pregnant with a strange, shifting energy. Arthur immediately reached out and pulled the folder back toward him. The tension that had been rigid in his shoulders suddenly vanished. He tapped the edges of the papers on the table to straighten them, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You did the right thing, Elle," Arthur said quietly, slipping the documents into his leather briefcase and snapping the brass locks shut. The sound echoed in the quiet study like a vault locking. "You don't have to worry about a thing anymore. We're in control now." Margaret stood up, her previous indignation vanishing as if it had never existed. "I'm going to make you some pancakes, darling. You need to keep your strength up." Chloe simply picked up her tea, offering Ellie a thin, patronizing smile before turning and walking out of the room. Ellie sat alone on the sofa, staring at the empty space on the coffee table where the papers had been. A strange, cold dread began to pool in her stomach, cutting through the haze of her grief. But she pushed it down. They were her family. They loved her. They were here to help. 2 months passed. The initial shock of Julian's death had faded into a dull, chronic ache. The house, once a sanctuary, had fully transformed into a territory occupied by a foreign army. Ellie rarely left the master suite, spending her days sitting on the floor of the nursery, playing silently with Leo. But as the fog of trauma began to lift, reality began to set in. And reality, Ellie was discovering, was incredibly expensive. It started with small things. The credit card she used to order Leo's specialized organic formula was suddenly declined. When she called the bank, the representative informed her politely that the card had been canceled by the primary account administrator. Confused and embarrassed, Ellie went downstairs to find Arthur. He was, as always, in Julian's study, the door firmly shut. Ellie knocked softly and pushed it open. "Dad? My credit card was declined at the online pharmacy. Did the bank freeze that account too?" Arthur didn't look up from his computer monitor. He was typing rapidly, his brow furrowed. "I canceled it, Ellie." Ellie stopped halfway across the room. "You canceled my card? Why? I need to buy Leo's formula." "Because we need to centralize the expenditures," Arthur replied, his tone clipped, treating her more like an annoying intern than a grieving widow. "I'm reviewing the personal spending. Julian spoiled you, Ellie. The amount of money flowing out of that account for frivolous things, designer baby clothes, expensive organic delivery services, it's unsustainable given the current crisis." "It's Leo's food, Dad," Ellie said, her voice tightening. "And what crisis? It's been 2 months. Julian's life insurance alone was worth $5 million. That should have cleared probate weeks ago." Arthur finally stopped typing and looked at her. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I told you, the SEC investigation into Vance Innovations has complicated everything. The life insurance policy is currently under review because Julian died in an active vehicle. and the insurance company is dragging their feet on the payout pending the police report. The liquid cash in the accounts is barely covering the mortgage on this monstrosity of a house and the property taxes. So how am I supposed to buy things for my son? Ellie demanded, frustration finally piercing through her depression. Arthur sighed, opening a desk drawer. He pulled out a sleek black checkbook and wrote out a check. He tore it out and handed it across the desk. Ellie took it. It was a check made out to her for $2,000. "This is your monthly allowance," Arthur stated flatly. $2,000. It's more than enough for groceries and basic necessities for you and the boy. Margaret is covering the household utilities and the chef's expenses out of our own pockets to help you out." $2,000? Ellie stared at the check, disbelief washing over her. "Dad, Julian's estate is worth nearly $80 million. You're giving me an allowance from my own husband's money?" "It is the trust's money, Ellie," Arthur corrected sharply, his voice rising, carrying the dangerous edge of a father scolding a petulant child. "And as the trustees, Chloe and I have a fiduciary duty to preserve the principal assets until the legal matters are resolved. You should be grateful we are managing this. If you were in charge, you'd spend it all into bankruptcy within a year. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call with the board of directors." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand and turned back to his screen. Ellie stood there for a long moment, the check trembling in her hand. She felt humiliated, small, and entirely powerless in her own home. She turned and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. As she walked down the grand hallway, she heard laughter coming from the formal dining room. She paused, peering around the corner. Chloe was sitting at the massive dining table, talking on her phone. Scattered across the polished wood were several glossy brochures for luxury real estate in Aspen, Colorado. Chloe was wearing a brand new limited edition Chanel blazer that Ellie knew cost upwards of $10,000. Sitting next to her, gleaming softly in the afternoon light, was a pristine diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. "Yes, absolutely," Chloe laughed into the phone, her voice bright and arrogant. "The seed funding for the new tech venture just cleared. The investors were incredibly generous. We're looking to secure the commercial lease in downtown Austin by next Friday. Draw up the paperwork." Ellie stood in the shadows, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Seed funding? Chloe hadn't had a successful job in 5 years. She had lived in a cramped apartment in Chicago before moving in here. Where was she getting the capital for a tech venture? And how could she afford Chanel and Cartier while Ellie was being handed a $2,000 allowance to feed Julian's son? Ellie backed away slowly, retreating up the stairs to the master bedroom. She closed the door and locked it. She walked over to the large bay window and looked out over the sprawling estate that Julian had built for them. For the first time since the funeral, the fog of grief vanished completely. It was not replaced by acceptance, or peace, or healing. It was replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. She remembered Arthur's words from the study. "I am reviewing the personal spending." Ellie walked over to her closet. Hidden in the back, beneath a pile of winter sweaters, was a small, fireproof safe. Julian had insisted on keeping a hard drive in there, a secure backup of his personal and corporate financial infrastructures. He had given her the passcode the day Leo was born. "Just in case, Elle. You're the smartest analyst I know. If anything ever happens, trust the numbers. They never lie." Ellie knelt on the floor and pulled the safe out. She stared at the keypad. Her hands were no longer trembling. The weeping, helpless widow who had signed away her power in the study 2 months ago was dead. She typed in the passcode. The safe beeped and clicked open. Ellie reached inside and pulled out the small silver hard drive. The metal was cold against her palm. She looked toward her locked bedroom door, knowing that somewhere downstairs, her father was sitting at her husband's desk, and her sister was wearing diamonds bought with phantom money. The trap had been sprung, and the predators thought they had caught a weak, grieving lamb. But as Ellie booted up her personal laptop and plugged in the hard drive, her eyes hardening into shards of flint, they were about to realize they had crawled into the nest of a viper. The soft blue glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark master bedroom, casting long, shifting shadows against the silk wallpaper. For the first time in 2 months, the heavy, suffocating weight in Ellie's chest was eclipsed by a different sensation, the sharp, clinical adrenaline of a financial analyst on the hunt. Julian's hard drive was a masterpiece of digital architecture. It wasn't just a storage device. It was an encrypted vault containing the true, unvarnished blueprint of their lives. Julian had been a man who trusted very few people with his code, and even fewer with his money. When Ellie finally bypassed the secondary firewall using the anniversary date of their first vacation, a series of intricately organized folders blossomed across the screen. She didn't start with the primary trust accounts. She knew Arthur would have already changed those surface-level passwords using his newly acquired power of attorney. Instead, Ellie went looking for the backdoor portals, the shadow accounts and holding entities Julian used to maneuver capital before it ever hit a retail bank. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the muscle memory of her former career flooding back. It took her less than an hour to locate the master ledger. She opened the primary spreadsheet, her eyes scanning the columns of dates, routing numbers, and massive offshore wire transfers. What she saw made the blood freeze in her veins. The Julian Vance Revocable Trust had not been frozen by the SEC. There was no corporate audit halting the distribution of funds. It was a lie, fabricated out of thin air by a man who knew his grieving daughter wouldn't have the strength to verify his claims. The trust was fully liquid, and it was bleeding out at an astonishing rate. Ellie's eyes tracked a series of massive outbound wire transfers that began exactly 4 days after Julian's funeral. The dates perfectly aligned with the afternoon she had sat in the study, weeping, and signed the co-trustee delegation documents. Arthur hadn't wasted a single minute. The moment the ink was dry on her signature, he had walked into a bank branch and initiated a systematic looting of her son's inheritance. $400,000 transferred on a Tuesday, $600,000 on a Thursday. A staggering $2 million moved just last week. Ellie highlighted the receiving account. The routing number belonged to a private wealth management bank in the Cayman Islands, but the account holder was a domestic entity, Vance Legacy, LLC. She opened a secure browser, utilizing a VPN Julian had installed to mask her IP address, and searched the Texas Secretary of State's corporate registry. She pulled the articles of incorporation for Vance Legacy, LLC. The company had been formed exactly 48 hours after Julian's fatal car crash. While Ellie had been picking out a casket for her husband, her father had been filing incorporation papers. The registered agent was Arthur Sterling. The listed chief operating officer was Chloe Sterling. Ellie leaned back against her pillows, the cold reality washing over her. Her sister's tech venture wasn't a startup. It was a shell company. Chloe's newly acquired Chanel wardrobe, the Cartier watch, and the glossy brochures for Aspen Real Estate weren't the fruits of successful fundraising. They were bought with the money Julian had worked his entire life to secure for Leo. She pulled up the itemized expenditures linked to the Vance Legacy LLC corporate card. There it was, an outbound wire of $185,000 to a luxury auto dealership in Austin, the exact price of a brand new Porsche 911. There were $45,000 in charges at high-end boutiques across Dallas. There was even a $12,000 charge for a private sommelier and a catered dinner at Arthur and Margaret's primary residence, a party they had thrown while Ellie was upstairs in this very room, sedated and weeping. A sickening wave of betrayal threatened to pull her under, but Ellie bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The physical pain grounded her. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her family didn't just want a piece of the pie, they wanted the entire bakery, and they were perfectly content to let her and Leo starve on a $2,000 monthly allowance while they did it. She spent the rest of the night downloading every single ledger, every wire receipt, and every fraudulent corporate filing onto a secondary, encrypted USB drive. By the time the first rays of dawn began to creep through the heavy blackout curtains, Ellie had mapped the entire perimeter of their theft. But knowing where the money went wasn't enough. She needed to know how Arthur was legally justifying the transfers without triggering an alert from the IRS or the probate courts. She closed the laptop, hid the drives back inside the fireproof safe, and buried it beneath her winter clothes. She walked into the master bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with dark, exhausted circles. She looked exactly like a broken, helpless widow. Good, she thought, splashing cold water on her face. Let them think I'm dead inside. Breakfast the next morning was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Ellie walked down the grand staircase wearing an oversized, faded sweater and a pair of loose sweatpants. She kept her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she entered the massive, sunlit kitchen, the smell of sizzling bacon and rich coffee was almost nauseating. Margaret was at the stove, humming a cheerful tune as she flipped pancakes. Arthur was seated at the head of the marble island, reading the Wall Street Journal, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Chloe was leaning against the counter, tapping away on her latest model iPhone, her neck adorned with a new glittering diamond tennis necklace. "Good morning, my sweet girl," Margaret cooed, immediately abandoning the stove to wrap Ellie in a tight, suffocating hug. "Did you sleep? You look so tired. Come, sit down. I made your favorite." "Thanks, Mom," Ellie mumbled, forcing her voice to sound weak and raspy. She sank into a bar stool next to Arthur, keeping her eyes downcast. Arthur lowered his newspaper, offering her a grave paternal nod. "Ellie, how are you holding up today? I was hoping to get your signature on a few routine tax clearance forms later this afternoon. Just administrative nonsense to keep the state off our backs." "Of course, Dad," Ellie whispered, stirring her coffee aimlessly. "Whatever you need, my head is so foggy. I can't concentrate on anything." Chloe snorted softly, not looking up from her phone screen. "You need to snap out of it, Ellie. It's been 2 months. Sitting around the house in pajamas isn't going to bring him back. You have a child to raise. You need to pull your weight around here. Mom is practically running herself ragged keeping this place clean." Before Julian's death, Ellie would have fired back. She would have reminded her sister that they employed a full housekeeping staff that Margaret had explicitly dismissed to maintain privacy. She would have pointed out the hypocrisy of Chloe lecturing anyone about hard work while living rent-free and wearing stolen diamonds. Instead, Ellie let her lower lip tremble. She forced a tear to spill over her eyelashes, letting it track slowly down her pale cheek. "I know," Ellie choked out, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. "I'm sorry, Chloe. I'm trying. I just feel so overwhelmed. I don't know how to survive without him." Margaret shot Chloe a furious glare before rushing to Ellie's side, stroking her hair. "Chloe, have some sympathy. Your sister is grieving. Don't you listen to her, baby. You take all the time you need. Daddy and I have everything under control. You don't need to lift a single finger." Arthur reached over and patted Ellie's hand, his touch feeling like cold slime against her skin. "Your mother is right. Sweetheart, you are fragile right now. That's why we're here. We bear the burden so you don't have to." Ellie nodded meekly, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you guys. I'd be a multi-millionaire raising my son in peace," she thought, her internal voice ringing with the cold, hard strike of a hammer. "But you just keep underestimating me. Please, keep thinking I'm stupid." Later that afternoon, true to his word, Arthur called her into the study. He presented her with a stack of complex legal documents, neatly flagged with his customary yellow sticky notes. Ellie played her part perfectly. She didn't read a single line. She simply took the pen, her hand shaking slightly for effect, and signed her name exactly where he pointed, offering him a tearful, trusting smile. Arthur's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction as he whisked the papers away. He was arrogant. He was sloppy. And Ellie was banking on that exact arrogance to destroy him. Night fell, and the Vance estate plunged into a quiet, heavy stillness. Ellie waited until the digital clock on her nightstand read 2 a.m. before she slipped out of bed. She didn't boot up her laptop this time. She needed physical evidence. She needed to know exactly what those routine tax clearance forms were that she had been blindly signing for the past 2 months. She crept down the grand staircase, moving like a ghost through the shadows. The security system was armed, but she knew the bypass codes. She slipped into the hallway leading to Julian's study. The heavy oak door was locked, a new deadbolt installed by Arthur just weeks prior. But Arthur, in his absolute confidence that his daughter was a weak, pill-addled mess, hadn't realized that Ellie possessed the master key to every door in the house, hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the library. The lock clicked softly, and Ellie slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. She didn't turn on the overhead lights, relying instead on a small, red-filtered pen light she had grabbed from Julian's emergency kit. The study smelled of Arthur's expensive cigars and bitter espresso. Ellie moved directly to the massive mahogany desk. She bypassed the locked drawers, knowing Arthur was too paranoid to leave the critical documents where a housekeeper might accidentally find them. Instead, she moved to the built-in bookshelves. Behind a row of heavy, leather-bound encyclopedias, There was a hidden wall safe. Julian had installed it years ago to hold physical stock certificates. Arthur had changed the combination, but he was a creature of habit. Ellie had watched him punch in numbers on the kitchen alarm panel enough times to know his patterns. His own birth year, followed by Chloe's, 1961-990. The safe beeped, a tiny green light illuminating in the dark. Ellie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside were stacks of thick manila folders. She pulled them out, setting them on the desk, and shined her red pen light over the documents. It took her less than 10 minutes to unravel the full extent of her father's legal fiction. Arthur wasn't just wiring money out of the trust. That would be too obvious, too easily contested by a probate judge. He was masking the theft as debt repayment. Spread before her were dozens of promissory notes. They were contracts, ostensibly signed by Julian Vance, detailing massive personal loans taken from Arthur Sterling. According to these documents, Julian had borrowed over $12 million from his father-in-law over the past 3 years to keep Vance Innovations afloat during rough development cycles. The documents explicitly stated that upon Julian's death, the Sterling family had the first lien right to collect on these debts from the principal trust before any funds could be distributed to the beneficiaries. Ellie stared at the papers, a cold, sharp laugh catching in her throat. Julian had despised Arthur. Julian thought Arthur was a relic of the 1980s corporate raider era, a man who destroyed companies for profit rather than building anything of value. Julian wouldn't have asked Arthur for a glass of water if he were on fire, let alone $12 million. Furthermore, Julian's company was entirely self-funded. He had never taken on private debt. Ellie leaned closer, examining Julian's signature at the bottom of a $2 million promissory note. To the untrained eye, it looked perfect. The sharp slant of the J, the sweeping aggressive loop of the V. But Ellie had been married to the man for 7 years. She had watched him sign thousands of checks, contracts, and birthday cards. Julian was left-handed. He applied heavy pressure on the downstrokes of his letters, leaving a slight, almost imperceptible indentation in the paper. Ellie ran her fingertip lightly over the signature on the contract. The paper was completely smooth. The ink was uniform, lacking the subtle variations in pressure that came from a human hand. It wasn't a forgery drawn by a pen. It was a high-resolution digital lift. Arthur had taken a genuine signature of Julian's, likely from an old Christmas card or a minor legal document, scanned it, and printed it onto these fabricated contracts using a high-end laser printer. She checked the dates on the notes. One of them, a loan for $3 million, was dated October 14th of the previous year. Ellie closed her eyes, accessing her razor-sharp memory. October 14th. That was the week Julian had taken her to Kyoto for their anniversary. He hadn't been in the United States, let alone sitting in a room signing a contract with Arthur Sterling. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They were constructing a paper trail of massive fabricated debts. By the time the probate court finally reviewed the estate, Arthur would present these notes. He would legally drain the entire $80 million trust to repay himself, leaving Ellie and Leo with nothing but the massive property taxes on an empty estate they could no longer afford. She used her phone to take high-resolution, uncompressed photographs of every single page, every fake contract, every forged signature, every notarized stamp that Arthur had likely bribed a friend to provide. As she was putting the folders back into the safe, a secondary file slipped out, hitting the floor with a soft thud. It was a thin, unmarked medical folder. Ellie picked it up, her brow furrowing. She opened it, shining the red light over the crisp white pages. It was a psychiatric evaluation. The patient name listed at the top was Eleanor Sterling Vance. Ellie's breath hitched. She began to read. The evaluation was written by a Dr. Philip Aries, a high-profile Dallas psychiatrist who catered to the ultra-wealthy. Ellie had never met the man in her life. Yet the report detailed a long, harrowing history of her supposed mental decline. It described her as exhibiting severe postpartum depression that had metastasized into psychosis following the death of her husband. It documented fabricated episodes of hysteria, neglect of her child, and a complete detachment from reality. At the bottom of the final page, Dr. Aris had written a formal medical recommendation. Due to the patient's severe and escalating psychiatric instability, it is my professional opinion that Eleanor Vance is entirely unfit to manage her own financial affairs, nor is she capable of providing a safe environment for a minor child. Full legal conservatorship and physical custody of the minor, Leo Vance, should be immediately transferred to her next of kin, Arthur and Margaret Sterling. The paper trembled in Ellie's hand. They didn't just want the money. The money wasn't enough for them. Margaret's constant coddling, the heavy, greasy food meant to make her lethargic, Chloe's constant gaslighting, telling her she was imagining things, telling her she was broken, the vitamins Margaret had been insisting Ellie take every morning to help with her nerves. They were building a case. They were actively constructing a narrative of a madwoman, a grieving widow who had lost her mind. They were going to use this fake psychiatric evaluation to strip her of her legal autonomy, lock her away in a high-end facility, and take Leo. They were going to take her son. A new kind of silence fell over Ellie. It was the silence of a bomb right before the timer hit 0. The grief that had anchored her to the floor for 2 months evaporated, burned away by a blinding white-hot fury. Arthur, Margaret, and Chloe thought they were playing a game of chess against a pawn. They thought she was a naive, shattered girl who would quietly step aside and let them consume her life. Ellie carefully placed the medical file back into the safe, locked it, and restored the books to their exact positions. She stood up, her posture perfectly straight, the shadows of the study clinging to her like armor. They wanted to play corporate warfare. They wanted to forge documents and steal her child. Fine, Ellie thought, her eyes glinting in the dark. Let's play. The following morning, the sun rose over the Vance estate, painting the sprawling lawns in brilliant shades of gold and green. Inside the master suite, Ellie sat at her vanity mirror, carefully applying a pale matte foundation to her skin. She used a subtle gray eyeshadow beneath her lower lashes, amplifying the hollow, exhausted look she had naturally worn for the past 2 months. When Margaret knocked softly and pushed the door open, Ellie was the very picture of a broken, fading widow. "Morning, my sweet girl," Margaret whispered, carrying a silver tray with a glass of orange juice and a small porcelain saucer. On the saucer sat 2 white, unmarked pills. "I brought your vitamins. Dr. Harris said it's crucial you don't miss a dose to help with the fog." Ellie looked at the pills. Just yesterday, she would have swallowed them without a second thought, grateful for the heavy, dreamless sleep they brought. Today, she knew exactly what they were: chemical handcuffs. "Thank you, Mom," Ellie said, her voice a raspy whisper. She picked up the pills with a trembling hand, popped them into her mouth, and took a large gulp of the orange juice. Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth, the terrifying warmth of a mother who truly believed she was doing the right thing by destroying her daughter. As soon as Margaret turned her back to draw the heavy curtains, Ellie spat the pills from under her tongue into a crumpled tissue in her pocket. She swallowed the rest of the juice loudly. "There," Ellie murmured. "All gone." "Good girl," Margaret cooed, kissing Ellie's forehead. "Now come downstairs. Your father wants us all to have breakfast together as a family." The moment the door clicked shut, Ellie flushed the tissue down the toilet. The lethargy that had clouded her mind for weeks was entirely gone, replaced by a crystalline, dangerous focus. Her first order of business was to build an army. Ellie knew better than to hire a local Dallas attorney. Arthur Sterling was a master networker. He played golf with the judges, he donated to the local prosecutors' campaigns, and he knew half the senior partners at the major law firms. If she breathed a word of this locally, Arthur would know about it before she even left the parking lot. Instead, Ellie waited until the house was quiet that afternoon. She locked her bedroom door, turned on the shower to mask any noise, and booted up Julian's encrypted laptop. She accessed a secure, untraceable communication portal Julian used for overseas corporate acquisitions, and sent a single, heavily encrypted file drop to a man named Elias Thorne. Elias was a senior partner at a boutique forensic accounting firm based in Manhattan. He was ruthless, brilliant, and possessed a deep personal hatred for white-collar scavengers. More importantly, Julian had once saved Elias's firm from a hostile takeover. Elias owed the Vance family a debt of honor. Accompanying the file drop was a brief message. "Elias, Julian is dead. My family is looting the trust and forging debt. They are trying to take my son. I need a ghost. Tell no one." The response came less than 20 minutes later. "Elias, reviewing the files now. Jesus Christ, Ellie. This isn't just theft. This is a slaughterhouse. Give me 48 hours. Ellie didn't have to wait 48 hours. By the following evening, Elias requested a secure voice call. Ellie sat on the floor of her walk-in closet, surrounded by Julian's old suits, the burner phone she had ordered via a dummy Amazon account pressed tightly to her ear. "The promissory notes are garbage," Elias's voice crackled through the encrypted line, crisp and professional. "The digital forgery is decent, but the metadata on the PDFs Arthur used to print them screams fraud. But Ellie, that's just the appetizer. The main course is your sister." Ellie's eyes narrowed in the dark. "Chloe, what did you find on Vance Legacy LLC?" "I dug into the routing numbers. Chloe didn't just set up a shell company to buy Chanel bags and a Porsche," Elias explained, the grim satisfaction evident in his tone. "She's running a Ponzi scheme, Ellie. Classic textbook Ponzi." Ellie felt the breath leave her lungs. "A Ponzi scheme, Chloe?" "She calls it Auratech Ventures," Elias continued. "For the last 2 years, she's been courting wealthy Dallas socialites, promising them a guaranteed 20% annual return on a proprietary AI trading algorithm that doesn't exist. She's raised over $8 million, but the well ran dry 6 months ago. The early investors started demanding their dividends, and she had no new capital coming in to pay them off." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Ellie's mind with terrifying clarity. "That's why she moved in," Ellie whispered, the realization sending a chill down her spine. "She didn't come to comfort me. She came because she was desperate. If she defaulted, those investors would sue. The SEC would audit her. And she'd be looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud," Elias confirmed. "So the moment Julian died, she and your father set up Vance Legacy LLC. They are actively using your son's inheritance to pay off Chloe's fraudulent investors to keep her out of prison. I'm looking at the wire transfers right now. $2 million went out yesterday to a group of furious dentists in Houston. Every time you sign one of those routine documents for your father, you are technically authorizing the bailout of a federal crime." Ellie closed her eyes, her fingernails digging crescent moons into her palms. Her own parents. They were willing to bankrupt their widowed daughter and their infant grandson to save their golden child from the consequences of her own arrogance. The sheer, breathtaking malice of it was almost too much to comprehend. "Elias," Ellie said, her voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, dead calm. "I want them destroyed, not just sued. I want them in handcuffs. How do we do it?" "We already are," Elias replied. "I bypassed the local authorities. Dallas PD would just tip Arthur off. I took the file straight to the FBI's white-collar crime division in New York. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins is taking the lead. But Ellie, Jenkins needs the trap to snap shut airtight. We have the forged notes, but to guarantee maximum federal sentences for conspiracy and interstate wire fraud, we need to let them get greedy. We need them to move a massive sum of money at once, firmly establishing the intent to defraud the estate beyond any shadow of a doubt." "How much?" "Chloe's remaining Ponzi liabilities sit at around $5 million, Elias said. "The moment she tries to move that kind of weight, the FBI will freeze the assets mid-transfer. But you have to sign the authorization. You have to play the victim until the very last second. If they suspect you know, they will shred the hard drives, burn the documents, and flee." "They won't suspect a thing," Ellie said, a dark, terrifying smile curving her lips in the darkness of the closet. "They think I'm losing my mind." Over the next 2 weeks, Ellie elevated her performance from a grieving widow to a woman teetering on the edge of a complete psychological collapse. She stopped brushing her hair. She spent hours staring blankly at the television, wrapped in a heavy blanket, ignoring the world around her. She allowed Margaret to lead her around the house like a toddler. Whenever Arthur spoke to her, she would look at him with wide, vacant eyes, her responses delayed and disjointed. The strategy worked perfectly. As Ellie appeared to shrink, the predators grew bolder. Chloe began openly flaunting her wealth, parading around the house in designer outfits, loudly discussing her successful business acquisitions on the phone. Arthur stopped knocking when he entered Julian's study, treating the entire estate as his personal kingdom. The climax of their arrogance arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Ellie was sitting in the formal living room, staring blankly at the fireplace, when Chloe marched into the room. She was wearing a sharp crimson blazer and holding a silver clipboard. Her eyes were bright with a manic, desperate energy. "Ellie, I need your signature," Chloe demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. She shoved the clipboard into Ellie's lap. Ellie looked down. It was a wire transfer authorization form. The amount requested was $5.5 million. The recipient was Vance Legacy, LLC, categorized under a fabricated ledger entry titled Emergency Corporate Liability Resolution. What is this, Chloe? Ellie stammered, letting her hands shake as she held the clipboard. She looked up at her sister, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. It's so many numbers. My head hurts. I don't understand. Chloe rolled her eyes, an ugly sneer twisting her perfectly made-up face. You don't need to understand it, Ellie. You just need to sign it. It's for Julian's company. Dad needs to clear a bridge loan immediately or the board is going to seize this house. Do you want to be homeless with Leo? No, I don't want to be homeless, Ellie whimpered, shrinking back into the sofa. She looked at the paper, then back at Chloe. But $5 million? Is there even that much left? Just sign the damn paper, Eleanor, Chloe snapped, her facade of the caring sister completely shattering. She grabbed a pen from her pocket and practically forced it into Ellie's hand. Stop being so pathetic and helpless for 5 minutes and do what you're told. We are breaking our backs to save your life. Ellie looked down at the paper. Beneath the mask of tears and confusion, her mind was as sharp and cold as a scalpel. This was it, the final nail, $5.5 million, the threshold for first-degree federal wire fraud. With a trembling, hesitant hand, Ellie pressed the pen to the paper. She didn't just sign her name. She made sure her signature looked slightly erratic, exactly how a heavily medicated, mentally unstable woman would sign. It was a masterpiece of forgery against herself. There, Ellie whispered, letting the pen drop from her fingers. Chloe snatched the clipboard back, her eyes scanning the signature with greedy relief. The tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a triumphant, arrogant smirk. Good. See? That wasn't so hard. Go back to watching your show. Chloe turned on her heel and practically sprinted out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, rushing to hand the FBI exactly what they needed. Ellie remained on the sofa, staring at the fire. The tears dried on her cheeks instantly. She reached into the pocket of her sweater, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of her burner phone. She sent a single text message to Elias. The bait is in the water. The reply came seconds later. Agents are positioned. The freeze will initiate the moment the routing numbers process. Get ready, Ellie. The cornered rats are going to bite. Elias was right. With the money seemingly secured, Arthur and Margaret had no more use for the facade of the loving parents. The final phase of their plan to permanently neutralize Ellie was about to be executed. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. It was a Saturday morning. Ellie was in the nursery, feeding Leo some sliced strawberries. She heard the heavy thud of the front door opening, followed by a low murmur of voices in the foyer. A few moments later, heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. Arthur stood in the doorway of the nursery. His face was a mask of solemn, theatrical grief. Margaret stood just behind him, clutching a handkerchief to her chest, her eyes wide with exaggerated sorrow. Behind them stood a tall, uncomfortable-looking man in a cheap gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. "What's going on?" Ellie asked, her voice small and fragile as she pulled Leo closer to her chest. Arthur stepped into the room, his posture rigid. "Ellie, sweetheart, please don't be alarmed. We are doing this because we love you, because we have to protect you from yourself." The man in the gray suit stepped forward. "Eleanor Vance?" "Yes?" The man held out the thick envelope. "You've been served." He turned and quickly walked away, eager to be out of the massive, oppressive house. Ellie looked down at the envelope, letting it rest on the arm of her chair. She didn't need to open it to know what it was, but she played her part to perfection. Her hands trembled as she peeled back the flap and pulled out the legal documents. The bold black letters across the top page screamed the reality of her family's betrayal. Petition for emergency conservatorship and temporary custody of a minor. Attached to the petition was the fabricated psychological evaluation from Dr. Philip Aris, declaring her a danger to herself and her child. "Conservatorship?" Ellie gasped, looking up at her parents with wide, horrified eyes. "Custody? You're trying to take Leo away from me?" Margaret let out a loud, tragic sob, covering her face with her hands. "It's for the best, baby. You're sick. You're so sick. You can't even take care of yourself, let alone a child. We found a beautiful facility in Arizona. They specialize in trauma. You'll go there, get some rest, and we will take care of Leo and the estate until you're well." "No!" Ellie cried out, clutching her son, her voice cracking with perfect, desperate panic. "No, you can't do this. I'm his mother. I'm not crazy." "The medical professionals disagree, Ellie," Arthur said, his voice cold, hard, and utterly devoid of pity. The paternal mask had completely dissolved, revealing the ruthless corporate predator underneath. "The emergency hearing is scheduled for Tuesday morning. The judge has already reviewed Dr. Aris's preliminary report. I suggest you don't fight this. If you make a scene in court, it will only prove how unstable you are." Arthur turned around, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder to guide her out of the room. He paused at the door, looking back at his daughter, the daughter he thought he had completely broken. "Pack your bags, Ellie," Arthur said softly. "It's over." The door closed, leaving Ellie alone in the nursery with her son. For a moment, the room was perfectly silent. Leo, sensing the tension, looked up at his mother with wide, questioning eyes. Ellie looked down at the legal papers in her lap. The petition to steal her child, the fake psychological report, the final desperate move of a family of parasites trying to consume the host. Slowly, the trembling in Ellie's hands stopped. Her breathing evened out. The look of shattered panic on her face melted away, replaced by an expression of terrifying, absolute serenity. She looked at her son, offering him a warm, genuine smile, the first real smile she had worn in over 2 months. "It's okay, baby," Ellie whispered, kissing the top of Leo's head. "Grandpa is right. It is over." She stood up, letting the conservatorship papers flutter to the floor like meaningless trash. She didn't pack a bag for a psychiatric facility in Arizona. Instead, she walked to her closet, pushed aside the winter clothes, and pulled out her sharpest, most intimidating black designer suit. She retrieved the encrypted USB drives from the safe, placing them meticulously into a pristine leather briefcase. Beside them, she placed the high-resolution photographs of the forged promissory notes, the damning forensic report from Elias Thorne, and the official FBI wire fraud tracking numbers provided by Agent Jenkins. Arthur and Margaret thought they had cornered a wounded animal. They were about to walk into a federal courtroom on Tuesday morning, fully expecting to easily cage a madwoman. They had no idea they were walking directly into an execution. Tuesday morning arrived with a blinding, crisp clarity. The torrential rains that had plagued Dallas for days had finally broken, leaving the sky a sharp, unforgiving blue. The Dallas County Family Courthouse was an imposing structure of limestone and glass, a place where families were quietly dismantled behind heavy mahogany doors. Arthur, Margaret, and Chloe Sterling walked through the polished marble lobby with the synchronized, untouchable confidence of royalty. Arthur wore a bespoke navy suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking every inch the benevolent, tragic patriarch. Margaret clung to his arm in a conservative black dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue for the benefit of anyone watching. Chloe walked a step behind them, her face fixed in a somber mask, though she couldn't resist checking the reflection of her Cartier earrings in the glass elevator doors. They were flanked by Richard Gable, one of the most expensive and aggressive family law attorneys in Texas. Gable carried a thick leather briefcase containing the fabricated psychiatric evaluation and the emergency conservatorship petition. It was, in their minds, a completely bulletproof operation. When they entered the private hearing room, the atmosphere was hushed and sterile. Judge Thomas Harlan, an older, stern-faced man with a reputation for zero tolerance, sat elevated behind the heavy wooden bench. A moment later, the heavy double doors opened, and Ellie walked in. There was a collective, almost imperceptible intake of breath from the Sterling family. They had expected Ellie to arrive in her pajamas, weeping, flanked perhaps by a confused, court-appointed public defender. They expected a woman shattered by grief and heavy sedatives. Instead, Eleanor Vance walked into the courtroom looking like a weapon forged from cold steel. She wore a tailored, razor-sharp black Saint Laurent suit. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe twist. Her eyes, devoid of any tears or exhaustion, were bright, focused, and chillingly calm. She carried only a single slim leather briefcase. Arthur's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of unease darting across his face. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering fiercely, "Why doesn't she look medicated? Margaret said she took her pills." "It doesn't matter," Gable whispered back, smoothing his silk tie. "We have the medical documentation." One good suit doesn't cure clinical psychosis. Let me handle her. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harlan looked down over his reading glasses. This is an emergency closed hearing regarding the petition for involuntary conservatorship and temporary custody in the matter of Eleanor Sterling Vance. Mr. Gable, you represent the petitioners? I do, Your Honor, Gable said, standing up smoothly. We are here today on a matter of profound tragedy. My clients, Arthur and Margaret Sterling, are seeking emergency conservatorship to protect their daughter Eleanor from herself and to protect their 2-year-old grandson from an unstable and highly dangerous environment. Gable spent the next 20 minutes painting a masterpiece of fiction. He described Ellie's supposed descent into madness following her husband's tragic death. He presented Dr. Aris's fabricated psychiatric evaluation. He painted Arthur and Margaret as the self-sacrificing heroes who had abandoned their own lives to move in and care for their helpless daughter. Furthermore, Your Honor, Gable concluded, his voice ringing with theatrical gravity, Eleanor's mental deterioration poses a catastrophic threat to the Julian Vance estate. We have sworn affidavits from Arthur Sterling, who has been forced to manage complex corporate debts that Julian left behind, just to keep a roof over his grandson's head. If Eleanor is allowed to retain control, her erratic behavior will bankrupt this family. Thank you, Mr. Gable, Judge Harlan said, his expression unreadable. He turned his gaze to the solitary woman sitting at the defense table. Mrs. Vance, you are appearing without counsel today. That is highly unusual in a conservatorship hearing of this magnitude. Do you understand what is at stake here? Ellie stood up. The room was dead silent. She didn't look at her parents. She didn't look at Chloe. She looked directly into the eyes of the judge. I understand perfectly what is at stake, Your Honor. Ellie's voice was smooth, resonant, and echoed with an authority that made Arthur's spine stiffen. But I have not retained a family law attorney because this is no longer a matter for family court. Gable let out a patronizing chuckle. Your Honor, as you can see, the respondent is suffering from delusions. Mr. Gable, you will speak when spoken to, Judge Harlan snapped, slamming his gavel down once. He looked back at Ellie. Proceed, Mrs. Vance. Ellie picked up her leather briefcase, unclasped it, and pulled out 4 thick, bound dossiers. She walked forward and handed 3 to the bailiff to distribute to the judge and opposing counsel, keeping one for herself. What my father and his attorney failed to mention, Your Honor, is the true nature of those corporate debts they claim to be managing. Ellie began, pacing slowly before the bench. Inside that dossier, you will find a comprehensive independent audit conducted by Thorne Forensic Accounting in New York. It details the systematic, fraudulent looting of my late husband's trust. Arthur shot up from his chair, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. This is absurd. The woman is having a psychotic break right in front of you. She's imagining conspiracies. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, the judge warned, opening the dossier. Tab 3, Your Honor, Ellie directed, her voice cutting through her father's bluster like a knife. You will see a series of promissory notes totaling $12 million, allegedly signed by my husband. Those signatures are high-resolution digital forgeries, verifiable by the metadata embedded in my father's own office printer. Julian Vance owed Arthur Sterling nothing. Those notes were fabricated as a legal shield to drain the trust. Margaret let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Chloe went entirely pale, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Objection, Gable stammered, frantically flipping through the damning forensic report, realizing in real time that his clients had lied to him. These documents are unverified. This is hearsay. They are verified, Mr. Gable, a deep voice boomed from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. The heavy double doors swung open and Elias Thorne stepped into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in a charcoal suit, exuding the kind of terrifying, quiet power that only came from Wall Street. Behind him walked a woman in a sharp navy windbreaker with the bold yellow letters FBI printed across the back. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins walked past the Sterling family without a glance, stepping up to the wooden partition. She flashed a federal badge at the judge. Agent Jenkins, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, she announced, her voice echoing in the shocked silence. With the court's permission, Your Honor. Judge Harlan nodded slowly, setting the dossier down. Agent Jenkins, Mrs. Vance informed my clerks of your impending arrival this morning. The floor is yours. Arthur's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. The absolute staggering reality of what was happening was finally penetrating his arrogant delusion. They hadn't trapped Ellie. Ellie had trapped them. "Mr. Sterling," Agent Jenkins said, turning to face Arthur. "4 days ago, you and your daughter Chloe initiated a wire transfer of $5.5 million from the Vance Revocable Trust to an entity known as Vance Legacy, LLC. You categorized this transfer as a corporate debt resolution. Can you confirm this under oath?" Arthur looked at his high-priced lawyer, panic widening his eyes. Gable physically backed away from his client, raising his hands. "I cannot advise you to answer that, Arthur. I am a family law attorney. You need criminal defense." "He doesn't need to answer," Ellie said, stepping forward, her eyes locked on her father. The fury she had held back for 2 agonizing months finally bled into her voice, cold and lethal. "Because the money never arrived. Did it, Chloe?" Chloe flinched as if she had been struck. She looked at Ellie, her lips trembling. "The FBI froze the wire the moment it hit the Federal Clearinghouse," Ellie explained, her gaze shifting to her sister. "Vance Legacy LLC isn't a tech startup. It's a shell company you set up to launder stolen money to cover your failing Ponzi scheme. Oratech Ventures is a fraud, Chloe, and you were willing to steal your own nephew's inheritance to keep yourself out of prison." "No!" Margaret shrieked, finally breaking character. She lunged toward Ellie, tears of genuine terror streaming down her face. "Ellie, please! She's your sister. We're your family. You can't do this to us. We were just trying to help. We just needed a loan. We would have paid it back." "You tried to declare me legally insane, Mother," Ellie said, her voice dropping to a terrifying absolute zero. She didn't take a single step back from Margaret's grasping hands. "You drugged my food. You forged medical records. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward and steal my 2-year-old son so you could spend his future on Cartier watches and country club dinners. Do not ever use the word family with me again." Margaret collapsed against the defense table, sobbing hysterically. Agent Jenkins stepped forward, pulling a stack of federal warrants from her jacket. "Arthur Sterling, Chloe Sterling, Margaret Sterling, I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, forgery, and perjury. Furthermore, the SEC has officially frozen all of your personal assets, bank accounts, and real estate holdings pending a full criminal investigation." 2 uniformed federal agents entered the courtroom, their handcuffs clinking sharply in the quiet room. Arthur Sterling, a man who had spent his entire life bullying, manipulating, and controlling everyone around him, seemed to shrink. The pristine, untouchable aura he had worn into the courtroom shattered completely. He looked at Ellie, his eyes pleading, desperate, stripped of all their former cruelty. "Ellie," Arthur rasped, holding out a shaking hand. "Ellie, I'm your father. Please. You have to tell them to stop. They'll put me in a federal penitentiary. I'll die in there. Please, Elle." Ellie looked at the man who had raised her. She thought of Julian, of the empire he had built with his bare hands. She thought of Leo, sleeping peacefully in his crib, unaware of the monsters that had almost consumed his life. She felt no pity. She felt no regret. "Julian used to tell me that in business, you can negotiate with an enemy, but you have to annihilate a traitor," Ellie said, her voice carrying clearly across the room as the agents pulled Arthur's arms behind his back. "You thought you were stealing from a grieving housewife, but you forgot that before I was a mother, before I was a wife, I was a Vance, and we don't lose." The snap of the steel handcuffs locking around Chloe's wrists echoed like a gunshot. Chloe began to scream, thrashing against the agents as they dragged her toward the doors, her designer heels slipping on the polished marble. Margaret was weeping uncontrollably, begging the judge, begging God, begging anyone who would listen. Ellie turned her back on them. She didn't watch as they were marched out of the courtroom, their lives completely and permanently destroyed. She walked over to Elias Thorne, who was packing up the forensic files. He looked up at her, a rare, genuine smile crossing his stern face. "You did good, Ellie," Elias said softly. "Julian would be damn proud of you." "Thank you, Elias, for everything," Ellie replied. "I'll be in touch next week. We have a lot of accounts to restructure." Ellie picked up her briefcase and walked out of the courtroom. When she stepped through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, the midday sun hit her face. It was warm, brilliant, and blindingly bright. The cold, Suffocating rain that had haunted her since Julian's funeral was finally gone. She took a deep breath of the crisp Texas air. She was 32 years old. She was the sole executor of an $80 million tech empire. She had protected her son. She had avenged her husband's legacy. And she had excised the rot from her bloodline with the precision of a surgeon. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed her nanny's number. "Maria?" Ellie said, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in months. "Hi. Yes, everything went perfectly. I'm coming home. Tell Leo his mom is on her way." She ended the call, slipped on her dark sunglasses, and walked down the courthouse steps. She didn't look back at the police cruisers idling in the loading bay. The past was locked away in a cell, and the future belonged entirely to her. The dust from the implosion of the Sterling family didn't settle for months. It hung in the Dallas air, a sensational storm of white-collar crime, shattered high society illusions, and federal indictments that fed the local news networks through the entire summer. 6 months after the dramatic arrests in Judge Harlan's courtroom, the Vance estate was unrecognizable from the dark, oppressive mausoleum it had become under Arthur's occupation. The heavy velvet drapes Margaret had installed were gone, replaced by sheer linen that allowed the Texas sunlight to flood the hardwood floors. The lingering smell of Arthur's cigars had been professionally scrubbed from the air ducts, replaced by the scent of fresh eucalyptus and white tea. Ellie Vance, now 33, sat at the head of the massive glass-topped conference table on the top floor of Vance Innovations' downtown headquarters. She wore a tailored ivory suit, her blonde hair cut into a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed a face completely devoid of the fragile grief she had weaponized a year prior. Around the table sat 12 men, senior executives, venture capitalists, and the corporate board of directors. For the past hour, they had been attempting to subtly pressure her into selling Julian's controlling shares to a rival tech conglomerate. They used soft voices, patronizing terms, and complex financial jargon, assuming that the young widow who had just survived a highly publicized family trauma would be eager to cash out and retreat to a quiet life. They were making the exact same mistake her father had made. "With all due respect, Mrs. Vance," said Richard Sterling, no relation, thankfully, a senior board member with a condescending smile. "The optics of the past 6 months have been turbulent. The SEC investigation into your family's attempted fraud, while cleared, has left the shareholders nervous. This buyout offer is 20% above market value. It's a golden parachute. You can take the capital, focus on raising your son, and let us handle the complexities of the tech sector." Ellie didn't respond immediately. She picked up the thick buyout proposal, holding it delicately between her manicured fingers. The room fell silent, waiting for her capitulation. Instead, Ellie dropped the proposal into the sleek metal trash can beside her chair. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the bottom echoed like a gunshot. Several executives flinched. "Let me clarify this situation for all of you," Ellie said, her voice dropping into a smooth, icy cadence that commanded absolute attention. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass. "My husband built this company from a garage in Austin to a billion-dollar enterprise without taking a single dime of outside debt. When he died, predators attempted to dismantle his legacy. I put those predators in federal prison. Do not mistake my silence for weakness, and do not mistake my gender for incompetence." She tapped a button on her iPad, and a projection lit up the screen behind her. It displayed a staggering array of profit projections, algorithmic efficiencies, and a restructured corporate hierarchy that Ellie had spent the last 6 months developing alongside Elias Thorne. "Vance Innovations is not for sale," Ellie continued, her eyes locking onto Richard's, watching his patronizing smile evaporate. "In fact, we are acquiring 2 of our mid-level competitors by the end of Q3. I have restructured the executive board. If any of you feel that a woman cannot steer this ship, I have severance packages drafted and waiting in my office. You are welcome to sign them today. Otherwise, I expect your full compliance with the new fiscal roadmap by Monday morning. Are we understood?" The boardroom was dead silent. The executives exchanged nervous glances. They were looking at a woman who had orchestrated the downfall of her own parents without batting an eye. None of them dared to test the sharpness of her blade. "Understood, Mrs. Vance." Richard swallowed hard, adjusting his tie. "Excellent. Meeting adjourned." Ellie stood up, gathered her tablet, and walked out of the room, leaving the most powerful men in Dallas stunned in her wake. When Ellie returned to the estate that evening, Elias Thorne was waiting for her in the library. The forensic accountant had evolved from a hired ghost into one of her closest confidants and the newly appointed chief financial officer of her personal trust. Elias was pouring 2 glasses of 18-year-old scotch. He handed one to Ellie as she kicked off her heels and sank into a leather armchair. "I heard about the board meeting," Elias chuckled, taking a sip. "Rumor on the street is you made the CEO of Vanguard Equity sweat through his custom shirt." They needed to be reminded who owns the building. Ellie smiled faintly, letting the burn of the scotch warm her chest. "What brings you by, Elias? You don't do house calls just to gossip about corporate terrors." Elias's expression sobered. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "The federal sentencing came down this afternoon. I thought you'd want to hear it in person, before the press gets a hold of it tomorrow." Ellie's grip on her glass tightened slightly. "Tell me." "Judge Harlan didn't hold back," Elias said, opening the file. "Chloe got hit the hardest. Between the massive wire fraud, the forged documents, and the separate indictments from the SEC regarding her Ponzi scheme, she was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. No possibility of early parole. Her victims are filing civil suits, but there's nothing left to take. She'll be an old woman by the time she gets out." Ellie looked into the amber liquid in her glass. She thought of Chloe, parading around the house in stolen Chanel, looking down her nose at the sister she thought was a pathetic, broken doll. 22 years in a concrete cell. "And my mother?" Ellie asked, her voice void of emotion. "Margaret played the victim card until the very end. She claimed Arthur brainwashed her and that she was merely a compliant housewife." Elias sneered slightly. The judge didn't buy it entirely, given her signature on the medical forgery documents. She was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security facility in Florida. She's officially bankrupt. The state seized their primary residence and their retirement accounts to pay off the restitution and legal fees. "Arthur?" 15 years, Elias said flatly. "Maximum security. Given his age and his history of high blood pressure, the odds of him surviving his sentence are statistically quite low. He tried to cut a plea deal by throwing Chloe under the bus, claiming the shell company was entirely her idea. Chloe retaliated by providing emails proving Arthur masterminded the digital forgery. They tore each other apart like starving dogs to save their own skin." Ellie closed her eyes. A deep, profound silence settled over her soul. It wasn't the silence of grief, but the silence of a battlefield after the last enemy had surrendered. The war was officially over. The viper's nest had been eradicated. "He requested a visitation," Elias added quietly, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a formal visitor authorization form from the Federal Correctional Institution in Segoville. Ellie looked at the paper. Arthur's signature, his real signature, shaky and frail, was at the bottom. "You don't have to go, Ellie," Elias said gently. "You owe him absolutely nothing. Let him rot in the dark." Ellie set her glass down. She picked up the paper, her eyes tracing the letters of her father's name. She remembered the day in the study, the way he had patted her hand, the way he had used the mask of a loving protector to slide a knife into her back. "I'm going," Ellie said softly. "Why?" "Because," Ellie looked up, her eyes cold and clear. "He needs to know that I didn't just survive him. I erased him." The Federal Correctional Institution in Segoville was a bleak, concrete fortress surrounded by razor wire and watchtowers. The air inside the visitation room smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and despair. Ellie sat at a small, bolted-down metal table. She wore a simple black dress, a stark contrast to the sterile, gray environment. She waited in absolute stillness. A heavy steel door buzzed open, and Arthur Sterling was led into the room by a corrections officer. The sight of him almost made Ellie gasp, though she kept her face perfectly impassive. The man who had walked into the Dallas courthouse a year ago had been a titan, a silver-haired, bespoke-suited predator radiating arrogance and power. The man shuffling toward her now was a ghost. He wore an ill-fitting, bright orange jumpsuit. His silver hair was thin and unkempt, his face heavily lined and pale from lack of sunlight. He had lost at least 30 pounds, his skin hanging loosely around his jaw. He looked small. He looked fragile. He sat down across from her, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. He looked at Ellie, his eyes welling with immediate tears. "Ellie!" Arthur croaked. his voice lacking any of its former booming authority. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "You came. Oh, God. You actually came." Ellie didn't say a word. She just looked at him, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I know you hate me," Arthur began, leaning forward as far as the chains would allow, desperation leaking from every pore. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I was greedy, Ellie. I lost my way. When Julian died, and all that money was just sitting there, the company was struggling, and I panicked. I just wanted to secure a legacy." "You wanted to steal from your grandson to pay for your other daughter's felonies," Ellie corrected him, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Don't dress it up as a moral failing, Arthur. It was premeditated theft." Arthur flinched at her use of his first name. He swallowed hard. "Ellie, please. You have to help me. I can't survive in here. The food, the noise. My heart can't take it. The public defender they assigned me for the appeals process is an idiot. He's 25 years old. He doesn't know what he's doing." Arthur looked around the room, lowering his voice to a pathetic conspiratorial whisper. "You have the trust. You have the company. You won, Elle. You took everything. But I'm still your father. Please, just hire me a real lawyer. A decent appellate attorney. I'm not asking for a pardon, just a reduction in sentence. And maybe put some money in my commissary account. I can't even afford decent soap, Ellie." He looked at her, his eyes begging. He was still trying to play the game. He was still hoping that somewhere, buried deep beneath her cold exterior, there was a trace of the obedient, desperate for approval daughter he had raised. Ellie reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a sleek, black checkbook. Arthur's eyes lit up with a pathetic, starved glimmer of hope. He watched as Ellie clicked a gold pen, Julian's gold pen, the exact same one Arthur had forced her to use to sign her life away, and began to write. She filled out the date. She wrote down Arthur's federal inmate identification number. She signed her name with a sharp, elegant flourish. She tore the check out of the book and slid it across the cold metal table. Arthur leaned forward, straining his neck to read the numbers. His face fell. The fragile hope in his eyes shattered, replaced by a deep, hollow realization of his own absolute defeat. The check was made out for exactly $2,000. "This is your monthly allowance," Ellie stated flatly, echoing the exact words he had spoken to her in Julian's study when she was begging for money to feed her son. $2,000. It's more than enough for soap and basic necessities. I expect you to be grateful." Arthur stared at the check, his hands trembling against his chains. A single tear escaped, rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "Ellie, please. This won't even cover a retainer for a paralegal. Don't do this." "You shouldn't have to think about money, Arthur," Ellie said, standing up smoothly, her voice a terrifying, soothing echo of Margaret's old gaslighting. "You should just focus on your time here. Focus on the consequences. Don't you worry about a thing on the outside. I am in control now." "Eleanor!" Arthur cried out, his voice cracking as she turned her back on him. "I'm your father. You can't leave me in here to die. I'm family." Ellie paused at the heavy steel door. She didn't look over her shoulder. She just stared at her own reflection in the reinforced glass. "I don't have any family left in Texas," Ellie said quietly, though the acoustics of the room carried her voice perfectly to his ears. "I just have a son, and you will never, ever be near him again." She signaled the guard. The door buzzed, and Ellie walked out, leaving Arthur Sterling sobbing over a piece of paper that represented the exact sum of his worth. The drive back to the estate was peaceful. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the Texas highway. Ellie rolled the window down, letting the warm wind pull at her hair. When she pulled through the massive iron gates of the Vance estate, the security guards tipped their hats to her. The house loomed in the distance, no longer a monument to grief or a battleground for corporate theft. It was just a home. She walked through the front doors, tossing her keys onto the entryway table. From the back garden, she heard the high-pitched, joyous sound of a child laughing. Ellie kicked off her shoes and walked through the sunlit corridors, stepping out onto the back patio. Maria, the nanny, was blowing bubbles across the manicured lawn. Leo, now 3 years old, was chasing them, his little legs pumping furiously, his blonde curls bouncing in the golden hour light. He looked so much like Julian that it sometimes made Ellie's breath catch, but it no longer brought her pain. It brought her a fierce, immovable pride. "Mommy!" Leo shrieked, abandoning a massive bubble to run toward her. Ellie dropped to her knees, opening her arms. Leo collided with her, a warm, solid weight that smelled of grass and baby shampoo. She buried her face in his neck, breathing him in, feeling the steady, rapid beat of his heart against her chest. "Did you catch them all, my brave boy?" Ellie whispered, kissing his cheek. "I popped 'em," Leo giggled, squirming in her grip. "I popped all the bubbles." "I know you did," Ellie smiled, standing up and lifting him onto her hip. She looked out over the sprawling estate, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. She had walked through the fire. She had let the world believe she was weak, naive, and broken, only to use their own arrogance as the fuel to burn them to the ground. She carried Leo back inside as the sun dipped below the horizon. She walked past the formal dining room, where Chloe had once sat flaunting stolen diamonds. She walked past the study, where Arthur had forged documents to steal her future. The ghosts of their greed were entirely gone, exorcised by the cold, unforgiving light of the truth. Ellie walked up the stairs to the master suite. On her nightstand sat a framed photograph of Julian, taken on their honeymoon in Kyoto. He was smiling, his eyes bright with ambition and love. Ellie reached out and gently touched the glass. "We're safe," she thought, a profound, unshakable peace settling over her. "I kept the wolves from the door. I protected our empire. I protected our son." She turned off the bedside lamp, wrapping her arms securely around her sleeping child. Outside, the night was quiet, still, and completely her own. The widow had shed her mourning clothes, the pawn had crossed the board, and the queen had finally taken her throne.